The search parties organized themselves with the sort of determined efficiency that only small English villages could muster when faced with a genuine crisis. Within an hour of the constable's initial report, practically every able-bodied man in St. Martin's Cross had volunteered to comb the fields and lanes surrounding the village. The local inspector, a pragmatic man named Thornton who had seen enough of life not to panic easily, established a makeshift headquarters in the village hall and began coordinating the search with methodical precision. Miss Marple, having excused herself from the fete with graceful discretion, made her way back to her cottage on the hill. She moved with unhurried purpose, her walking stick tapping against the pavement in its familiar rhythm, her mind working through the various fragments of information she had gathered over the preceding months. She had lived long enough to understand that villages operated according to their own invisible social hierarchies, and Eleanor Hartley's position within St. Martin's Cross's delicate ecosystem was considerably more complicated than her straightforward job title might suggest. By early evening, as the summer light began its slow retreat, the first genuine alarm was raised. A farmer named Hutchins, searching near the old mill with several others, had discovered Eleanor's leather satchel caught on the wooden fence that bordered the mill stream. The bag was empty of its usual contents. Her letters, her appointment book, containing only a handkerchief and a single glove. More concerning still was the fact that the fence showed signs of disturbance, as though someone had climbed over it in considerable haste. Inspector Thornton arrived at the mill within the hour, his manner becoming noticeably more official and considerably less optimistic. He cordoned off the area with rope and began asking careful questions about the stream's depth, its currents, and whether anyone had noticed anything unusual in the days preceding Eleanor's disappearance. The implication, though nobody spoke it aloud, hung heavily in the cooling air. It was at this precise moment that Miss Marple decided to visit the vicar. She found him in his study, a small, book-lined room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. He was reviewing the prayer book for the following Sunday's service, though she suspected his attention was not entirely focused on the liturgy. He looked up at her entrance with evident relief, as though grateful for any distraction from his troubled thoughts. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, gesturing to a chair. "A terrible business, absolutely terrible. Poor Eleanor. One hopes, of course, but one cannot help fearing the worst." "One cannot indeed," Miss Marple agreed, settling herself into the offered chair with practiced grace. "Though I find that in my experience, the worst is often not quite what we imagine it to be. People are remarkably unpredictable creatures, are they not? I was wondering if you might tell me a little about Miss Hartley. You see, I've formed only the most superficial acquaintance with her, and yet she strikes me as a person of considerable complexity." The vicar leaned back in his chair, a slight frown creasing his brow. "An interesting observation, Miss Marple. What do you mean by complexity, precisely?" "Simply that she seemed to navigate our village society with a certain wariness, as though she were perpetually aware of being observed and judged. I've noticed that some of our more established residents view her with a degree of suspicion that seems to exceed what her mere status as an outsider would warrant." The vicar was silent for a long moment, and Miss Marple perceived in that silence the struggle between discretion and honesty. She waited patiently, having learned decades ago that silence often accomplished more than direct questioning. "Eleanor came to us through an agency," he finally said. "Thornfield Manor's Mr. Ashford required secretarial assistance, and she was recommended as capable and dependable. Her references were entirely satisfactory, and she has conducted herself with propriety." He paused, choosing his words with evident care. "However, there is a certain tension, I suppose one might call it, between Eleanor and some of the village women, particularly around Mr. Ashford and his wife." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "How very human." "You understand, then?" the vicar said, relieved at not having to elaborate further. "It is nothing concrete, you understand. Simply the sort of unspoken tension that arises when a young, educated woman of uncertain background arrives in a close-knit community and takes a position close to a man of some standing and social prominence. "And Mrs. Ashford?" Miss Marple inquired delicately. "How has she received Miss Hartley?" The vicar stood and walked to the window, gazing out toward the darkening fields beyond. "Dorothy Ashford has been civil, one must say, though I have observed her watching Eleanor at church socials with an expression I can only describe as calculating." Miss Marple rose to leave, having extracted what she needed to know. As she reached the door, she turned back to the vicar with a gentle smile. "You know, Reverend, I find myself increasingly convinced that before this matter is concluded, we shall discover that Eleanor Hartley's disappearance involves far more complexity than anyone currently suspects. People rarely vanish without reason, and those reasons are invariably rooted in relationships far more intricate than surface appearances suggest." The vicar nodded slowly, though whether he understood her meaning entirely, Miss Marple could not be certain. She left him to his meditations and made her way back into the gathering dusk, where the village was settling into a night of anxiety and uneasy speculation. The discovery came shortly after midnight, when the search parties, now augmented by police from the neighboring town, decided to drag sections of the mill stream with weighted nets. Eleanor Hartley's body surfaced in water no deeper than 4 feet, her pale dress billowing around her like some grotesque water lily. She had been in the water for approximately 6 hours, the preliminary examination suggested, and the cause of death appeared to be drowning, though the inspector made careful note of a peculiar bruising on her left temple that seemed inconsistent with an accidental fall. By morning, St. Martin's Cross had transformed entirely. The cheerful bunting from the fete hung in mockingly bright contrast to the police vehicles now stationed throughout the village. Yellow tape cordoned off areas surrounding the mill, and Inspector Thornton had established what amounted to a miniature police station in the village hall, conducting interviews with anyone who might have information about Eleanor's final hours. The theory of accident had been quietly discarded. The bruising on her temple, combined with the suspicious displacement of the fence, suggested something far more sinister. Miss Marple learned of the discovery through the village grapevine, which operated with remarkable efficiency, regardless of the hour. Mrs. Weatherby had telephoned the butcher, who had mentioned it to the greengrocer, who had sent word via the postman to half the village before breakfast. By 9 o'clock, the news had reached Miss Marple's cottage, delivered by her gardener with a mixture of horror and barely concealed fascination. She received Inspector Thornton at 10:30, having prepared tea and biscuits as though he was simply a social caller rather than a senior police official investigating a murder. He was a man in his early 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors, and his eyes possessed that particular quality of weariness that came from understanding human nature in its worst manifestations. He sat somewhat uncomfortably in her parlor, cradling the teacup as though it might bite him. "You knew Miss Hartley," he began, consulting a small notebook, "or at least you had some acquaintance with her." "A very slight acquaintance, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied, "though I confess to having formed a favorable impression. She seemed a capable young woman, perhaps a touch reserved, but fundamentally decent." "Reserved?" the inspector repeated, making a note. "That's interesting. Most people describe her as confident, even somewhat bold in her manner. Would you elaborate on that observation?" Miss Marple considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. "I think, Inspector, that what some might interpret as boldness, I perceived as caution masquerading as confidence. She moved through our village society with the careful awareness of someone who understands she is not entirely welcome. There is a difference between genuine confidence and the studied performance of it." The inspector looked at her with renewed interest. "You're quite observant, Miss Marple. Tell me, did you notice any particular tensions between Miss Hartley and the other residents? Most particularly with regard to Mr. Ashford and his wife," Miss Marple said calmly. though I would hesitate to suggest that such tensions necessarily indicate anything beyond the ordinary social friction that arises when a young, unmarried woman of independent means takes a position in close proximity to an established married man. Village life operates according to certain unwritten rules, Inspector, and Miss Hartley seemed to exist somewhat outside those rules. Did she now? He mused. And what do you know of Mr. Ashford himself? That he is a man of considerable charm and not inconsiderable ambition. That his marriage, though outwardly cordial, appears to lack warmth, and that he possesses the sort of appearance and manner that tends to inspire both admiration and, occasionally, jealousy in those around him. The inspector closed his notebook with a soft snap. You seem to know rather a great deal about St. Martin's Cross for someone who maintains such a quiet existence, Miss Marple. She smiled gently. I have found, Inspector, that one learns a great deal by simply observing and listening. People tend to speak quite freely around elderly spinsters, as though our advancing years render us somehow invisible or incapable of understanding what we hear. It is a useful misconception. After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple walked to her window and gazed out across the village. Police were now interviewing residents systematically, and she could see Mr. Ashford emerging from the police station, his expression troubled. Behind him, at a discreet distance, came his wife Dorothy, her face pale but composed, her posture suggesting a woman in perfect control of her emotions. That afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Lucy Pemberton, a young woman who worked as an assistant at the local library and whom Miss Marple had occasionally encountered at church functions. Lucy appeared nervous, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being observed, and she spoke in urgent, hushed tones. Miss Marple, I felt I must tell someone, and I thought perhaps you would understand. I saw Eleanor the day she disappeared, you see. It was late afternoon and she was walking deliberately toward the mill, but she wasn't alone. She was meeting someone. Someone she clearly knew because I heard her call out a name. And whose name did she call, dear? Miss Marple asked, though she rather suspected she already knew the answer. It was Mr. Ashford, Lucy whispered. She called out, Edward, I knew you would come. Miss Marple, what does it mean? Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. It means, my dear, that the truth of Eleanor Hartley's death is far more complicated than anyone currently realizes, and that before this matter is resolved, we shall discover that nearly everyone in this village has been harboring secrets they would prefer to keep hidden. The revelation of Lucy Pemberton's observation sent immediate reverberations through the village investigative machinery. Within hours of Lucy's hesitant disclosure to Miss Marple, word had inevitably reached Inspector Thornton, and the inspector's entire focus shifted with the precision of a compass needle realigning toward magnetic north. Edward Ashford, who had been regarded as a concerned employer grieving the loss of a valued staff member, suddenly found himself transformed into the primary suspect in what was now officially classified as a murder investigation. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her cottage the following morning with her knitting, observed the unfolding drama with the detached interest of someone watching a play whose ending she could not quite predict, though she suspected she understood more of the plot than the other audience members. The police brought Mr. Ashford in for formal questioning, and by midday the village was ablaze with speculation and conjecture. The narrative that emerged was almost too perfectly constructed. A man with a wandering eye, a young secretary vulnerable to flattery, a neglected wife at home, and a clandestine meeting that had ended in tragedy. Inspector Thornton appeared at her door again on the afternoon of the third day, and this time his manner was notably more satisfied. He accepted her offered tea with less hesitation than before, and his expression suggested that he believed the fundamental mystery had been solved. We have established a clear timeline, Miss Marple, he explained, consulting his notes with evident satisfaction. Mr. Ashford left his office at approximately 1 o'clock, claiming he had business to attend to in the neighboring village. In fact, he proceeded directly to Clover Field, where he met Miss Hartley by prearrangement. The two of them walked toward the mill together. According to his own testimony, he became angry when Miss Hartley informed him that she intended to accept a position as a governess in Scotland and would be leaving St. Martin's Cross within a fortnight. An argument ensued, during which Mr. Ashford claims she stepped backward, struck her head on the fence, and fell into the stream. "And do you believe him?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. The inspector hesitated fractionally. "I believe he was present, and I believe an argument occurred. As for the precise sequence of events, well, that is where the evidence becomes slightly less clear. The bruising on Miss Hartley's temple is consistent with contact against the fence, but it could also have been inflicted by force. The preliminary examination suggests that she was struck before entering the water, though whether by accident or design cannot be definitively determined." "How very difficult for you," Miss Marple observed sympathetically, "to have a suspect without absolute certainty of intent." "Precisely so," the inspector agreed. "However, the evidence suggests culpability, and we have sufficient grounds to proceed with charges. The motive is clear: a man attempting to conceal an affair by eliminating the woman involved. It is a sordid tale, but not an uncommon one." After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple remained seated by her window for a considerable period, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Something about the inspector's summary troubled her, though she could not immediately articulate precisely what. It was not that the narrative was implausible. On the contrary, it possessed the superficial coherence of a solution that explained most of the available evidence. Rather, it was that it felt incomplete, as though a critical piece of the puzzle had been overlooked or misplaced. That evening, she received an unexpected telephone call from Dorothy Ashford. "Miss Marple," the woman's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "I wonder if I might impose upon you for a brief conversation. There is something I must tell someone, and I find myself trusting you implicitly." An hour later, Dorothy Ashford sat in Miss Marple's parlor, her composure cracking like ice beneath spring thaw. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of habits established years earlier and adhered to through sheer force of will. But beneath the composed exterior lay genuine distress, and she twisted her handkerchief with compulsive intensity as she spoke. "I did not love my husband, Miss Marple," she began without preamble. "I suspect that is not particularly surprising to you. What may surprise you is that I am profoundly grateful for Eleanor Hartley's presence in our household. My husband is not a malicious man, but he is weak. He requires the attention and admiration of women to feel adequately alive. I learned long ago that attempting to provide such attention myself was futile. Eleanor's presence provided an outlet for his need without threatening my position as his wife." "I see," Miss Marple said quietly, though she was not entirely certain she did. "But here is what troubles me," Dorothy continued. "The police believe my husband deliberately harmed Eleanor, but I knew Eleanor rather better than he did. She was not the naive, helpless creature people assumed. She was strategic, deliberate, and far more intelligent than anyone gave her credit for. If she was meeting my husband that afternoon, it was not because she had lost her head to romantic feelings. It was for a purpose." "And what purpose might that have been?" Miss Marple asked gently. Dorothy leaned forward, and her eyes held a particular intensity. "I do not know precisely, but I know that Eleanor had discovered something about my husband, something that frightened her. She came to me 3 days before her death and asked if I knew certain facts about Edward's business dealings. When I admitted I did not, she seemed disappointed, almost as though she had hoped I would corroborate whatever she had learned." Miss Marple felt something shift in her understanding of the case, like a kaleidoscope rotating to reveal an entirely different pattern. "Mrs. Ashford, I believe you have just provided me with information that will prove remarkably relevant to determining what actually happened at the mill. After Dorothy Ashford had departed, leaving behind only the faint scent of her expensive perfume and the lingering impression of her troubled confession, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence for nearly an hour. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern that differed substantially from the one Inspector Thornton had so confidently constructed. She rose finally and retrieved a small leather-bound notebook from her writing desk, in which she had maintained for nearly 50 years observations about the patterns of human behavior. She turned to a section marked Blackmail and Coercion and read through several entries, each documenting cases from her own village experience, where financial desperation had driven otherwise decent people to extraordinary measures. The following morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village bank, where she had maintained an account for the better part of 3 decades. The manager, Mr. Carstairs, was a man of considerable discretion, but he was also a man who understood that Miss Marple occupied a particular position in the village hierarchy, not through wealth or social prominence, but through the simple fact that she was regarded as trustworthy and unlikely to misuse information. She presented herself in his office with her characteristic gentle manner and inquired whether he might provide her with certain information regarding the recent financial transactions of Edward Ashford's business account. Mr. Carstairs hesitated, bound by professional confidentiality, but Miss Marple's quiet request was framed not as a demand, but as an appeal to his sense of justice. She explained with admirable economy that she believed critical information regarding Eleanor Hartley's death might be contained within financial records, and that she was attempting to ascertain whether the police investigation had pursued all relevant avenues. After considerable deliberation, Mr. Carstairs agreed to provide her with general information about the volume and pattern of transactions, if not their specific details. What emerged from this conversation was most illuminating. Edward Ashford's business had been in considerable financial distress for the better part of 6 months. Large sums had been withdrawn at irregular intervals, and the account balance had declined precipitously. More significantly, there had been several transfers to an external account, the purpose of which was entirely unclear from the banking records alone. Armed with this information, Miss Marple sought out the local solicitor, Mr. Weatherby, whose wife had been so eager to condemn Eleanor on the day of the fete. She discovered him in his office, sorting through property deeds with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized his profession. He received her politely, if with some surprise at the nature of her visit. "Mr. Weatherby," she began, without unnecessary preamble, "and I find myself requiring some clarification regarding the legal implications of certain business practices. Specifically, I wonder whether you might advise me on what constitutes grounds for criminal prosecution in cases of embezzlement or financial fraud." The solicitor's expression grew cautious. "That is a rather broad question, Miss Marple. Might I inquire as to the context of your interest?" "I'm attempting to understand," she explained, "whether a person in a position of business authority who had engaged in certain questionable financial practices might feel sufficiently threatened by discovery to resort to extreme measures. Hypothetically speaking, of course." Mr. Weatherby leaned back in his chair, and Miss Marple observed with interest the subtle change in his demeanor. He suddenly seemed to understand that her inquiry was not merely academic. If such a person believed their misconduct was about to be exposed, and if they perceived that exposure would result in criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and social disgrace, then yes, Miss Marple, such circumstances might conceivably motivate extreme behavior, though I trust you understand I'm speaking purely theoretically. "Of course," Miss Marple assured him. "And would such a person be likely to regard a person who had discovered their misconduct as a significant threat to their security and well-being?" "Undoubtedly," the solicitor replied. "And depending on the severity of the misconduct and the desperation of the individual in question, one might envision scenarios in which the discovery posed a sufficient threat to overcome ordinary moral restraints." Miss Marple thanked him and departed, her mind working through the implications of this new understanding. Edward Ashford's financial difficulties were not merely the result of poor business judgment or simple mismanagement. They appeared to be the result of deliberate embezzlement or fraud, possibly involving client funds or business partner investments. Eleanor Hartley, positioned as his secretary, would have had access to detailed knowledge of these transactions. If she had discovered evidence of his misconduct and threatened to expose it, the motive for her elimination became considerably more substantial than a mere romantic entanglement. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended a tea gathering at the home of the vicar's wife, where she encountered several of the village's more prominent women. During the course of casual conversation, she mentioned, quite innocuously, that she had noticed Eleanor seemed to have been taking considerable interest in Mr. Ashford's business affairs during her time as his secretary. Mrs. Weatherby, predictably, seized upon this observation and revealed that Eleanor had indeed made inquiries of various individuals regarding Ashford's financial reputation and business practices. She had specifically asked Mr. Carstairs, the bank manager, about the typical patterns of business account activity. By evening, the true outline of Eleanor Hartley's death had begun to crystallize in Miss Marple's mind. What the police had interpreted as a crime of passion born from romantic entanglement now revealed itself as something far more calculated and deliberate. Eleanor had not been merely a secretary and would-be lover. She had been a threat, and her meeting at the mill had not been a romantic assignation, but rather a confrontation regarding discovery of serious criminal misconduct. The question that remained was whether Edward Ashford, guilty of fraud though he might be, was equally guilty of murder. Miss Marple decided that the time had come to share certain observations with Inspector Thornton, though she approached the prospect with considerable caution. She had learned through decades of involvement in village mysteries that police officers, while generally competent in matters of procedure and evidence collection, sometimes lacked the particular insight that came from intimate knowledge of a community's social dynamics. Accordingly, she telephoned the inspector and requested that he visit her cottage at his earliest convenience, mentioning that she possessed information that might prove relevant to his investigation. When Inspector Thornton arrived the following morning, he appeared somewhat harried. The case against Edward Ashford was proceeding, but apparently not with the smooth certainty the inspector had initially anticipated. There were complications, inconsistencies, matters that did not align perfectly with the narrative of a crime of passion. He accepted Miss Marple's tea with evident gratitude and settled into a comfortable chair with the resignation of a man preparing to be bored but willing to indulge an elderly civilian. "Inspector," Miss Marple began, "I've taken the liberty of investigating certain financial aspects of Mr. Ashford's business affairs. Nothing illegal, you understand. Merely inquiries conducted through ordinary social channels. What I have discovered suggests that Mr. Ashford's financial position is considerably more precarious than surface appearances would indicate." She proceeded, with methodical precision, to explain what she had learned regarding the unexplained withdrawals from his business account, the apparent embezzlement or fraud that seemed to underlie his recent difficulties, and Eleanor Hartley's evident interest in his business practices. She presented her observations not as accusations, but as information that might redirect the inspector's investigation toward a more complete understanding of motive. The inspector listened with growing interest, his expression shifting from polite tolerance to genuine engagement. When Miss Marple had concluded, he set down his teacup and regarded her with new respect. "You have quite effectively identified precisely what we have been struggling to determine," he admitted. "Our financial investigation of Ashford's business revealed significant irregularities, but we were uncertain whether they constituted grounds for prosecution independent of the murder charge. Your observation regarding Miss Hartley's apparent knowledge of these matters provides critical context. However, Miss Marple, this information creates a rather complex situation. If Ashford murdered Miss Hartley to prevent exposure of financial misconduct, that constitutes premeditated murder rather than a crime of passion. The evidence we have collected, however, is more consistent with a spontaneous act rather than deliberate planning. I confess, Miss Marple said carefully, that I have been troubled by precisely that inconsistency. The narrative of a crime of passion suggests certain characteristics of impulsivity and emotional extremity, yet a man willing to commit murder to conceal financial fraud demonstrates considerable calculation and deliberate intentionality. Those two aspects of behavior do not align perfectly, do they? The inspector frowned, recognizing the validity of her observation. You are suggesting, I believe, that the crime itself may have been less premeditated than the motive that prompted it. A man confronted with exposure, arguing with a woman who threatens his security, acting in the heat of the moment rather than with cold deliberation. Precisely, Miss Marple affirmed, though I would add another consideration. Has anyone investigated whether Mr. Ashford was, in fact, the only person with significant motivation to wish Miss Hartley silenced? This question hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple observed the inspector's expression shift as he grasped the implications of her inquiry. She continued softly, "You see, Inspector, Eleanor Hartley represented a threat not merely to Mr. Ashford, but potentially to any number of individuals whose secrets or misconduct she might have discovered through her position in his office. The question becomes not simply whether Ashford had motive, but whether he was the individual most desperate to prevent her from speaking." Over the following 2 days, a peculiar phenomenon occurred throughout St. Martin's Cross. Inspector Thornton's investigation took on new dimensions, exploring financial connections and business relationships that extended far beyond Edward Ashford's immediate circle. It emerged that Ashford was not acting alone in his financial misconduct. He had been, in fact, junior partner in a scheme involving several prominent village figures, including a local property developer and a businessman with interests in the neighboring town. Miss Marple observed these developments from her cottage with quiet satisfaction, though she maintained her characteristically low profile. She had not, after all, made any direct accusations. She had merely provided information and asked pertinent questions, allowing the inspector to draw his own conclusions through the application of proper investigative procedure. On the 4th day following Eleanor's death, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Michael Ashford, Edward's younger brother, who worked as a solicitor in London and had come down to support the family during the crisis. He was a man of perhaps 45, with intelligent eyes and a manner suggesting both competence and genuine distress at his family's circumstances. "Miss Marple," he said after the customary pleasantries had been exchanged, "I've heard that you have taken considerable interest in the circumstances surrounding Eleanor Hartley's death. I wonder if I might discuss with you certain matters that have come to light regarding my brother's business practices. I believe there may be aspects of this situation that the police have not yet fully understood, and I am concerned that an innocent man may be proceeding to a conviction based on incomplete information." Miss Marple regarded him with considerable interest. Here, at last, was a complication she had not entirely anticipated, a voice suggesting that the apparent simplicity of the case might conceal layers of far greater complexity. She invited him to sit, poured fresh tea, and prepared to listen to whatever revelation he had come to impart. Michael Ashford's revelation, when it came, proved to be of considerable significance, though not precisely in the manner Miss Marple might have anticipated. He explained with evident reluctance and obvious emotional distress that his brother Edward had indeed engaged in financial misconduct, but that the extent and nature of this misconduct had been considerably more complex than a simple case of embezzlement. "You see," Michael began, his legal training evident in the precise manner of his exposition, "Edward became entangled with a property developer named Hastings approximately 18 months ago. Hastings approached him with what appeared to be a legitimate business opportunity. They were to acquire several parcels of land near the village boundary and develop them for residential housing. The scheme promised substantial returns, and Edward was convinced it represented an opportunity to dramatically improve his financial position. "And what went wrong?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "The scheme itself was fraudulent," Michael explained. "Hastings was systematically misappropriating investor funds. He presented false documentation, falsified property valuations, and essentially orchestrated an elaborate confidence scheme. Edward discovered the fraud approximately 6 months ago, after he had already invested considerable sums on behalf of several clients and business associates." Miss Marple felt a sudden clarity regarding Eleanor Hartley's position and motivation. Miss Hartley discovered evidence of this fraud? "Indeed," Michael confirmed. "She had been reviewing financial documents in Edward's office and noticed irregularities in the property valuations and title documentation. She brought her observations to Edward, who was forced to confess the entire situation. He had been trapped in a terrible dilemma. If he exposed Hastings, his own negligence and poor judgment would be revealed, and he would likely face professional ruin. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in ongoing fraud." "And what did Miss Hartley propose to do with this information?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already understood the trajectory of events. "She informed Edward that she intended to report the matter to the appropriate authorities," Michael said quietly. She was quite firm in her conviction that the fraud could not be allowed to continue, regardless of the consequences to Edward's reputation. She gave him a deadline of 1 week to report the matter voluntarily, after which she would do so herself. "When did this conversation occur?" 2 days before her death," Michael replied. "I believe Eleanor was meeting Edward at the mill to discuss the matter further. She may have been attempting to persuade him to take action, or perhaps to present him with additional evidence of the fraud. I do not know precisely what transpired at the mill, Miss Marple, but I know my brother. He is not a violent man. He is weak, certainly, and prone to poor judgment, but he is not a murderer." Miss Marple rose and walked to her window, gazing out across the village with thoughtful intensity. The picture that had seemed to clarify was becoming obscured once again, though not in an entirely negative manner. Rather, it was becoming vastly more intricate, revealing layers of motivation and circumstance that extended far beyond a simple romantic entanglement. "Mr. Ashford," she said, turning back to face Edward's brother, "I wonder if you have considered that your brother may not be the individual with the most substantial motivation to prevent Miss Hartley from exposing this fraud. Mr. Hastings, the property developer, would face far more severe consequences than your brother. Professional disgrace for Edward would be significant, but criminal prosecution, imprisonment, and financial ruin would be vastly more severe outcomes for the individual who orchestrated the fraud." Michael's expression shifted, and Miss Marple perceived that this consideration had not previously occurred to him with sufficient force. "You are suggesting that Hastings murdered Eleanor Hartley?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that we should consider whether the available evidence has been properly evaluated in light of all possible suspects. Inspector Thornton appears to have focused his investigation on your brother with considerable intensity. Yet the motive for Eleanor's death might be far stronger for an individual facing criminal prosecution than for an individual facing merely professional embarrassment." Over the course of the following day, Miss Marple made discreet inquiries regarding Marcus Hastings, the property developer who had orchestrated the fraudulent scheme. What emerged was a portrait of a man considerably more ruthless and dangerous than Edward Ashford. Hastings had a history of questionable financial dealings, had been involved in litigation on several occasions, and possessed a reputation for vindictiveness toward those who crossed him. He had also been present in the village on the afternoon of Eleanor's death, attending to business matters at the property site he was developing. Inspector Thornton received this information with visible frustration, as though the investigation, which had seemed to be proceeding toward a satisfactory conclusion, had suddenly become exponentially more complicated. He nonetheless assigned officers to investigate Hastings' movements and financial situation with new urgency. By evening, the investigation had taken a dramatic turn. Officers discovered that Hastings had been seen in the vicinity of the mill on the afternoon in question, though he had failed to mention this fact during his initial police interview. More significantly, financial records revealed that Hastings had made a substantial transfer of funds to an external account on the very day of Eleanor's death, suggesting possible flight preparations. When police moved to apprehend Hastings for questioning, they discovered that he had already departed St. Martin's Cross, leaving behind a hastily abandoned residence and several months of unpaid bills. The manhunt was expanded to include neighboring counties, and Miss Marple understood that the case, which had seemed resolved, had in fact entered a new and considerably more uncertain phase. The search for Marcus Hastings extended over the course of 10 days, during which St. Martin's Cross existed in a state of peculiar suspension between certainty and doubt. Edward Ashford remained in custody pending further investigation, though the charges against him had been temporarily suspended, pending clarification of the evidence. The village itself seemed to retreat into a cautious wariness, as though the residents understood that they had been operating under false assumptions and were uncertain what other deceptions might yet be uncovered. Miss Marple, however, found herself growing increasingly troubled by certain inconsistencies in the narrative that was beginning to emerge. She had spent sufficient time observing human nature to understand that while Hastings possessed obvious motive to eliminate Eleanor, something about the mechanics of the crime as currently understood did not align perfectly with the character of a man she had come to know through second-hand description and public record. Hastings was a manipulator and a schemer, certainly, but he was also a man accustomed to operating through cunning and deception rather than physical violence. He was, moreover, a man of considerable caution, unlikely to commit a murder in broad daylight in a location where he might easily be observed. The Eleanor Hartley who had been pulled from the mill stream bore signs of impulsive violence, a death born from sudden rage rather than calculated planning. On the 11th day following Eleanor's discovery, Miss Marple requested a private meeting with Inspector Thornton. She received him in her parlor, and she noted with interest that he appeared considerably more weary than he had at their previous encounters. The investigation had expanded beyond what he had anticipated, spreading tentacles into financial crimes and fraud investigations that required coordination with multiple agencies and jurisdictions. "Inspector," Miss Marple began without unnecessary preamble, "I wonder if I might ask you to reconsider certain aspects of your investigation. Specifically, I find myself questioning whether the flight of Mr. Hastings necessarily indicates his guilt in Eleanor Hartley's death." The inspector set down his teacup with a faint expression of frustration. "Miss Marple, Hastings had clear motive. He was in the vicinity at the relevant time, and he has chosen to flee rather than submit to questioning. These circumstances do not suggest innocence. Nor do they constitute definitive proof of guilt," Miss Marple replied gently. "They indicate that Mr. Hastings had motivation to silence Miss Hartley before she could expose his fraud, and they demonstrate that he recognized the danger of the investigation being directed toward his activities. However, flight in response to the threat of financial crime prosecution does not necessarily correlate with commission of murder. A man guilty of fraud but innocent of murder might reasonably fear that cooperation with an investigation into the fraud would expose his criminal conduct regardless of his innocence regarding the girl's death." The inspector leaned back in his chair, and Miss Marple observed the struggle playing across his features as he attempted to reconcile her observation with his own investigative conclusions. "What precisely are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that we have established multiple individuals with significant motivation to wish Eleanor Hartley silenced. Edward Ashford faced professional and personal ruin if his negligent involvement in the fraud was exposed. Marcus Hastings faced criminal prosecution and imprisonment if the fraud was brought to light. But there is a third individual whose motivation, I suspect, has not been adequately explored." "And who might that be?" Dorothy Ashford, Miss Marple said quietly. Edward's wife. The inspector's expression registered genuine surprise. You cannot be serious, Miss Marple. Dorothy Ashford is a woman of 50 years, physically unimposing and with no apparent motive to commit such a crime. On the contrary, Miss Marple corrected gently. She possesses both motive and, if I am not mistaken, opportunity. Consider, Inspector, Eleanor Hartley represented not merely a threat to Edward's financial security, but a far more personal threat to Dorothy's life. If Eleanor exposed the fraud, Edward would face ruin. Moreover, if Eleanor was indeed romantically involved with Edward, or if Dorothy believed her to be so, then Eleanor represented a threat to Dorothy's marriage and social position. But Eleanor was meeting Edward at the mill, not Dorothy, the inspector protested. Was she? Miss Marple asked. We have only the testimony of a farmhand who observed a young woman crossing Clover Field. Lucy Pemberton heard Eleanor call out a name which she identified as Edward. But is it not possible that she misheard or that the name was called in a different context than we have assumed? The inspector rose and began to pace her small parlor with evident agitation. You are suggesting that Dorothy Ashford, not her husband or Hastings, murdered Eleanor Hartley. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said, that the bruising on Eleanor's temple, the apparent struggle at the fence, the systematic nature of the crime, these elements suggest not the impulsive violence of a man confronted with exposure, but rather the deliberate, even desperate action of a woman protecting what she perceived as her essential position and security. Dorothy Ashford is a woman accustomed to control, to maintaining perfect composure regardless of circumstance. If she perceived Eleanor as a threat to her marriage and her standing in the community, she would be capable of eliminating that threat with cold determination. But how would she have lured Eleanor to the mill? The inspector demanded. How would she have arranged the meeting? That, Miss Marple replied, is where Dorothy's intelligence and her knowledge of both Eleanor and Edward proves essential. She would have orchestrated the meeting precisely as we have understood it to occur, between Eleanor and Edward. But she would have ensured that she, not Edward, was the individual Eleanor encountered. Perhaps she intercepted Eleanor on the path. Perhaps she was waiting at the mill. The specific mechanics are less important than understanding her motivation and her capability. The inspector ceased his pacing and regarded Miss Marple with new understanding. You believe we have been investigating the wrong individual entirely. I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that we have been so focused on the obvious suspects that we have overlooked the person who possessed both the motive and the opportunity to commit this crime, with the greatest efficiency and the least likelihood of detection. Inspector Thornton left Miss Marple's cottage with considerably more to consider than he had brought with him. She observed his departure with quiet satisfaction, understanding that she had planted seeds of doubt regarding his current investigative trajectory that would, with time and proper cultivation, grow into fuller understanding. However, she also recognized that mere suggestion, however compelling, would not suffice to redirect an official investigation. What was required was evidence, or at the very least, a revelation that would compel Dorothy Ashford to reveal herself through her own actions. It was with this understanding that Miss Marple made her way to the Ashford residence on the afternoon following her conversation with the inspector. She had not telephoned ahead, preferring to present herself as an elderly woman making a social call, the sort of innocent gesture that would scarcely register as suspicious in Dorothy's mind. She was received in the drawing room with the impeccable courtesy that Dorothy invariably extended to village callers, though Miss Marple perceived in her hostess's manner a certain tension, a brittleness beneath the composed exterior that had not been present during their previous encounters. Miss Marple, Dorothy said, gesturing to a seat. How unexpected. I confess I find myself somewhat isolated at present. The circumstances surrounding Edward and that dreadful girl have created considerable awkwardness in the village. I suspect people scarcely know how to address us. I find that people often surprise us with their kindness during difficult periods, Miss Marple replied gently. though I confess I've come to discuss a matter of some delicacy. I wonder if you might indulge an elderly woman's curiosity regarding certain events of the afternoon on which Miss Hartley died." Dorothy's expression remained composed, but Miss Marple observed a subtle tightening around her eyes. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, Miss Marple. I was here at home that afternoon. Edward was the one who went out." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That is the version of events that has been presented to the police. However, I find myself wondering whether it is entirely accurate. You see, I've been considering the peculiar nature of Eleanor's death, and I have come to understand that it bears certain characteristics that suggest a woman's hand rather than a man's violence." Dorothy set down her teacup with deliberate care. "That is a rather extraordinary suggestion, Miss Marple. I hope you do not intend to imply what I believe you to be implying." "I intend nothing more than honest exploration," Miss Marple said softly. "You see, Mrs. Ashford, I've lived a very long time, and I've observed that women who feel their essential security threatened sometimes act in ways that might surprise those who do not fully understand their circumstances. When a woman perceives that her position, her marriage, her very identity is being undermined, she can become capable of remarkable things." "You are speaking in riddles," Dorothy said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier composure. "I'm speaking from experience," Miss Marple corrected. "I once knew a woman, very much like yourself, educated, refined, accustomed to maintaining absolute control over her domestic circumstances. She discovered that her husband was becoming involved with a younger woman, and that this younger woman represented not merely a romantic threat, but a genuine danger to the woman's social position and security. The younger woman was also in a position to expose certain family secrets. This woman, so very much like yourself, eventually took action to eliminate the threat." Dorothy rose abruptly and walked to the window, her back to Miss Marple. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You cannot prove anything, Miss Marple." The statement, so direct and so revealing, hung in the air between them like a confession. Miss Marple felt a profound sadness wash over her, recognizing in this moment the tragedy of human weakness and the terrible consequences that flowed from desperate acts undertaken in panic and fear. "Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if you would tell me what actually occurred that afternoon. Not for the purposes of the police, necessarily, but simply for the sake of understanding how a woman of your evident intelligence and breeding came to find herself in such circumstances." Dorothy turned back to face her, and Miss Marple was struck by this sudden transformation in her appearance. The composed mask had slipped, revealing beneath it a woman of profound exhaustion and despair. "Eleanor was going to destroy everything," Dorothy said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Edward's career, our marriage, our position in this community. She was going to expose the fraud, and in doing so, she would expose Edward's complicity, his weakness, his infidelity. I could not allow that. I had spent 30 years building a life, maintaining standards, preserving dignity in the face of Edward's constant humiliations. I was not going to permit that girl to dismantle everything I had constructed." "And so you arranged to meet her at the mill?" Miss Marple inquired softly. "I intercepted her on the path," Dorothy explained, her voice taking on a peculiar flatness. "I told her that Edward had sent me to discuss the matter, that perhaps we could reach some accommodation. She was so eager to believe me, so certain of her own righteousness. We walked to the mill together, and I attempted to persuade her to remain silent. When she refused, when she insisted on proceeding with her plan to expose everything, something simply broke within me." Miss Marple listened as Dorothy described, with growing emotion, how the confrontation had escalated. Eleanor had turned to leave, and Dorothy, driven by panic and desperate determination, had struck her. The girl had stumbled, fallen against the fence, and then into the water. Dorothy had stood there, watching her struggle, understanding in that moment that she had irrevocably transformed herself from a woman protecting her interests into a murderer. I knew I had destroyed myself, Dorothy concluded quietly. But in that moment, I discovered that I had also destroyed Eleanor Hartley, and that knowledge has haunted every moment since. Miss Marple remained seated in Dorothy's drawing room for several minutes following this confession, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her expression one of profound compassion tempered by the weight of her knowledge. She understood that she now stood at a critical juncture, one that would determine not merely the course of the murder investigation, but the trajectory of multiple lives. Dorothy Ashford sat across from her, seemingly diminished, as though the act of confession had drained from her the vital force that had sustained her through the preceding days of deception and fear. "Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe you understand what must now occur. You have committed a grave crime, and while I understand the circumstances that led to it, understanding does not constitute excuse or absolution." "I know," Dorothy replied, and there was in her voice an almost palpable sense of relief, as though the burden of concealment had become unbearable, and confession, however terrible its consequences, offered a perverse form of liberation. "I have known since the moment Eleanor entered the water that my life, as I had constructed it, was over. Everything since has been merely prolonging the inevitable. Nonetheless," Miss Marple continued, "I must inform Inspector Thornton of what you have disclosed. It would be both unethical and illegal for me to remain silent regarding this confession, regardless of my personal feelings toward you or my sympathy for the circumstances that prompted your actions." Dorothy nodded slowly, as though she had expected precisely this response. "Of course. I would not ask you to shield me from justice, Miss Marple. Indeed, I suspect I would find no peace if you did. But I would ask you one thing. When you speak to the inspector, would you attempt to make him understand that while my actions were reprehensible, they were not those of a fundamentally wicked person? I am not attempting to escape responsibility, merely to ensure that the full context of my desperation is understood." Miss Marple rose to her feet with the careful dignity that characterized all her movements. "I shall ensure that Inspector Thornton understands precisely what has transpired and the circumstances that led to Eleanor Hartley's death. Justice, Mrs. Ashford, is not merely a matter of assigning guilt or innocence. It is also a matter of understanding the full complexity of human motivation. You will face consequences for your actions. Severe consequences, I suspect. But those consequences will be informed by complete understanding, rather than incomplete suspicion or misdirected accusation." She left Dorothy's residence and made her way directly to the police station, where she requested an immediate meeting with Inspector Thornton. When the inspector appeared, still bearing the weariness of his extended investigation, Miss Marple explained what had transpired during her visit to the Ashford household and the confession that Dorothy had offered. The inspector's reaction proceeded through several distinct phases: initial skepticism, then dawning comprehension, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance. He had, after all, been forced to confront the limitations of his initial investigative assumptions, and he had begun to recognize that certainty regarding guilt was a far more elusive commodity than the mechanics of police procedure typically acknowledged. "You obtained a confession?" he asked, more for confirmation than inquiry. "Mrs. Ashford volunteered the truth," Miss Marple corrected gently. "She did not require interrogation or accusation. She simply required someone to listen with understanding while she acknowledged what she had done." "And you believe her account to be truthful?" "I do," Miss Marple affirmed, "though I would suggest that you allow her to provide her full statement under proper conditions, with appropriate legal representation present. She deserves that courtesy, and it will ensure that any subsequent legal proceedings are conducted with absolute propriety." Within hours, Dorothy Ashford had been taken into custody and provided with legal counsel. Her confession, delivered formally to the inspector and recorded with proper documentation, confirmed the essential facts that Miss Marple had outlined. The investigation, which had consumed the village's attention for nearly 2 weeks, suddenly resolved itself into clarity. The true murderer had been not the desperate employer seeking to conceal fraud, nor the schemer attempting to avoid exposure, but rather the woman who had occupied the position of victim's social superior, the woman who had felt her world threatened by a younger rival and had acted with fatal desperation to preserve it. The village itself seemed to exhale upon learning the truth, as though it had been holding its collective breath during the uncertainty. Yet the resolution of the crime brought little genuine satisfaction. Eleanor Hartley remained dead, a young woman whose life had been extinguished by another woman's panic. Edward Ashford faced legal consequences for his involvement in the fraud, though he would not face murder charges. And Dorothy Ashford, arrested and charged with Eleanor's murder, would face a trial that would expose not merely the crime, but the constellation of weaknesses, resentments, and desperate fears that had prompted it. Miss Marple received a telephone call from Michael Ashford the day following Dorothy's arrest. He expressed gratitude for her role in exposing the truth and in ensuring that his brother would not face a murder charge to which he was innocent. He also expressed profound sadness regarding his sister-in-law's circumstances, recognizing in her desperation the universal human tendency to commit terrible acts when facing the dissolution of carefully constructed lives. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he said simply. "You have brought clarity to a terrible situation. I only wish it had not been necessary." Miss Marple, hearing the genuine pain in his voice, felt the full weight of what had transpired. Justice had been served, and the guilty party identified. But the cost of that justice was measured not in abstract legal satisfaction, but in broken lives, shattered families, and the recognition that the comfortable certainties of village life concealed depths of human weakness and desperation that erupted into terrible violence. The trial of Dorothy Ashford took place 3 months following Eleanor Hartley's death in the Assizes Court of the neighboring county town. The proceedings attracted considerable attention from the press, as such cases invariably did. The prospect of a respectable woman of some social standing accused of murder possessed a particular fascination for journalists and the reading public. Miss Marple did not attend the trial itself, finding such public spectacles distasteful, but she followed the proceedings through newspaper accounts and through conversations with those who had witnessed the legal arguments and evidence presentations. The defense attempted to construct a narrative emphasizing Dorothy's desperation and the extraordinary circumstances that had prompted her actions. The prosecution, conversely, emphasized the calculated nature of her crime. The deliberate interception of Eleanor, the false representation made to lure her to the mill, the violence inflicted upon a defenseless young woman. The jury, composed of 12 ordinary citizens attempting to navigate the complex moral and legal questions that the case presented, deliberated for nearly 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty of murder. Dorothy Ashford received a sentence of life imprisonment, a consequence that seemed to Miss Marple to represent a kind of justice, though justice of a peculiar and tragic sort. She had destroyed a young woman's life and, in doing so, had irrevocably destroyed her own. The village that had been her home, the social position she had so carefully cultivated, the marriage she had fought so desperately to preserve, all had been sacrificed in a moment of panic and violence. Edward Ashford, freed from suspicion regarding Eleanor's death, nonetheless faced legal consequences for his involvement in the fraud perpetrated by Marcus Hastings. He was convicted of financial misconduct and received a suspended sentence, a resolution that seemed to acknowledge both his culpability and his status as someone driven by weakness rather than genuine criminal intent. He resigned his position and withdrew from public life, his reputation irrevocably damaged by the scandal surrounding his wife's crime. Marcus Hastings was apprehended in London some 6 weeks after his initial flight, attempting to board a vessel bound for the continent. He faced prosecution for the fraud scheme that had been the underlying cause of Eleanor's death, and he too received a substantial prison sentence. In a manner that Miss Marple found darkly ironic, the man who had initially seemed the obvious suspect in Eleanor's murder had in fact played no direct role in her death, though his actions had set in motion the chain of events that had culminated in her drowning. It was on a warm afternoon in early autumn, nearly 4 months after Eleanor's death, that Miss Marple received a visitor she had not anticipated. Lucy Pemberton, the young library assistant whose observation regarding Eleanor's final meeting had proven so crucial to the investigation, came to her cottage with evident purpose. She appeared troubled, and Miss Marple invited her inside with her characteristic warmth. "Miss Marple," Lucy said, declining the offered tea, "I've been struggling with something since the trial concluded, and I felt I must speak with you. I keep thinking about what I told you, about hearing Eleanor call out Mr. Ashford's name. My testimony essentially confirmed that Eleanor was meeting with him, and that led the investigation initially in his direction, even though he was innocent of her murder." "You simply reported what you had observed," Miss Marple said gently. "There was no deception in your testimony." "I know," Lucy said, "but I cannot help feeling that my words played a role in directing suspicion away from Mrs. Ashford, at least initially. If I had been uncertain, if I had admitted doubt regarding the name I heard, might the investigation have proceeded differently?" Miss Marple regarded the young woman with sympathy. "My dear, you cannot carry responsibility for the consequences of truthful testimony. You reported what you heard to the best of your recollection. That the investigation subsequently took a particular path was not your responsibility, but rather the result of how law enforcement officers chose to interpret the available evidence. You acted with honesty and integrity. That is all that can be asked of anyone." Lucy departed somewhat reassured, though Miss Marple recognized that she would carry residual guilt regarding her role in the case for some considerable time. It was the burden that witnesses often bore, the knowledge that their words had contributed to events beyond their control or full comprehension. In the weeks following the trial's conclusion, St. Martin's Cross gradually began to resume its ordinary rhythms. The initial shock of Eleanor's death and the subsequent revelation of Dorothy's guilt faded into the background of village consciousness, though it never entirely disappeared. Such events left permanent marks on communities, alterations in the social fabric that could never be entirely mended. Miss Marple found herself reflecting frequently on the case as she worked in her garden or attended church services. She had been instrumental in exposing the truth, yet she took no particular satisfaction in that achievement. Rather, she felt a profound sadness regarding the waste of human potential and the tragedy of lives destroyed by weakness and desperation. One afternoon, sitting in her cottage with her knitting, she found herself considering the fundamental lesson that Eleanor Hartley's death had reinforced. She had always maintained that villages were microcosms of human nature in all its complexity, and that by observing the patterns of ordinary life, one could discern the underlying motivations that drove people to extraordinary acts. Eleanor's death had been no exception. It had arisen not from grand passion or elaborate criminal conspiracy, but from the simple, tragic collision of a young woman's moral conviction with an older woman's desperate determination to preserve her constructed existence.